My name is Renee Halcourt. I'm 54 years old. And 11 weeks after my husband died, I was standing in my linen closet at 2:47 in the morning, refolding pillowcases I had already folded twice, because it was the only thing I could think of to do with the fact that I was sleeping better than I had in 20 years, and I was terrified of what that meant about me. That's where this story starts. Not at the funeral, not at the hospital, not at the moment he told me the truth. It starts in a linen closet, at 3 in the morning, with a woman who had spent 28 years being a certain kind of wife, and who was now standing in the quiet of a house that felt different without him in it. Not empty, different. Like a room where someone had finally opened a window that had been painted shut for decades. I need to tell you what he said to me 4 days before he died, because it changed something. Not the way you think. Not a dramatic, movie moment change. Something quieter than that. Something that took weeks to even locate inside myself. He looked at me from that hospital bed we'd set up in the living room, and he said, in that thin voice he'd had for the last few months, he said, "I need you to know that what you wanted, in your 20s, your 30s, all of it, I heard you, and I made a decision that I knew better. And I'm telling you now because I don't want you to spend the rest of your life thinking you were wrong for wanting it." 28 years of marriage, and that was what he had to say at the end of it. Before I tell you what came before that moment, before I tell you about the years that led to that sentence, I want to ask something. If you're watching this right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, go ahead and like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, because this story has a lot of ground to cover, and I don't want you to miss any of it. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's on the other side of this. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, in a house where love was shown through doing and never through saying. My father worked nights at a paper mill and led Sunday services at our Baptist church on the weekends, a man of routine and contained expression. My mother taught 3rd grade and kept a house so clean it almost vibrated. We were not poor. We were not expressive. We were the family that managed, quietly, and called that normal. I have one brother, Gary. He left at 19 and did not come back in any meaningful way. I used to think he was running from something. Now I think he just understood earlier than I did that you are allowed to leave. When I was 11, my mother had what nobody in our house called a nervous breakdown, but that's what it was. She went quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet, a heavy, unreachable kind of quiet. And for 8 months, I ran that house. I cooked, I cleaned, I covered for her with the neighbors and with my father's church friends. I made everything look fine. Nobody thanked me. Nobody asked if I was okay. I was 11 years old, and I learned the most dangerous lesson of my life. That being the one who holds things together is a role you can disappear into, and nobody will notice you've gone because everything still looks fine from the outside. I want to stop here for just a second, because if any part of what I just described feels familiar, if you know what it's like to be the one who manages, the one who covers, the one who makes things look okay when they aren't, I think you're going to understand everything that comes in this story in a very specific way. And I want you to stick with me. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of what I'm about to tell you. And if you know someone who has been the quiet one, the one who held it all together while everyone else looked away, share this with them. They need to hear that they are not alone. Now let me keep going. I went to Western Kentucky University on a partial academic scholarship, worked 15 hours a week at the campus library to cover the difference, studied education because I was good with children, and because my mother's life had shown me that teaching was a form of showing up that mattered. I graduated in 3.5 years because I was efficient. I was always efficient. I had been trained for it. I met Douglas when I was 23. He was 30, already 7 years into his career at the manufacturing plant in Clarksville, settled in a way that felt like certainty. And I was drawn to certainty the way you're drawn to something you've never had, but recognize on sight. He wasn't loud. He wasn't showy. He just knew things. He walked into a room and it reorganized itself around him, quietly, without drama. I mistook that for safety. I had dated one man before Douglas, a kind, uncomplicated man named Theo from my hometown, who loved me plainly and asked nothing of me except to be present. I left him when I met Douglas. I have thought about Theo exactly twice in this story, and both times it was with the particular ache of recognizing a door you walked past and kept walking. Douglas and I married when I was 26. The wedding was a church wedding in Bowling Green. His mother wore beige and cried at the reception. My mother made punch. I wore a dress I had sewn alterations into myself because it didn't quite fit when it arrived, and I didn't want to make a fuss. The first 4 years were the years I look back on now and see clearly, the way you can only see something clearly once you have enough distance. I taught second grade. I loved it. I was good at it in the specific way of someone who has spent her whole life reading the emotional temperature of a room and adjusting accordingly. Douglas was proud of me in the way of a man who says the right things at dinner parties, and then, in private, creates an atmosphere where what you do feels somehow peripheral. Not through cruelty, never through cruelty, through something more invisible than that. There was a night in our 3rd year of marriage. I had been offered a position at a different school, a better school, a longer commute, a small raise that would have mattered. I told Douglas over dinner, and he didn't say no. He didn't argue. He just went quiet in a particular way, a way that made the air in the room thicker. And over the next 2 weeks, without a single direct conversation about it, I let the offer expire. I told myself it was the commute. I told myself I chose this. That was the first time. I didn't know it was the first time. You never do. Gail Winthrop came into my life at a PTA meeting the year Mara started kindergarten. She walked in 12 minutes late in a burgundy dress with amber earrings that swayed when she moved, and she sat down next to me and whispered, "Are they always this long, or did I pick the wrong Tuesday?" I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. She was divorced. She had 2 kids. She managed a bank branch, and she had the specific energy of a woman who has made the hard choice for herself and found, to her quiet satisfaction, that it was the right one. Douglas found her too much. He said it politely, the way he said all difficult things politely. She's a lot. As if a woman taking up her rightful amount of space was a character flaw. Gail was a lot. That was why I needed her. The year Mara turned 7, Gail called me and said she had 2 tickets to Portugal. She'd gotten a deal. She wanted me to come for 10 days. She said, "Renee, you have never been anywhere. Come somewhere with me." I brought it up to Douglas on a Sunday evening when the kids were in bed. I said it carefully. I always said things carefully by then, though I hadn't noticed the habit forming yet. I told him about the tickets, the dates, how Gail would cover most of the cost. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He just looked at me for a long moment and then went back to the paper in his hands. I never called Gail to tell her I couldn't go. I just let the window close. And when she asked me what happened, I said Douglas had something going on with work. I had already learned, without anyone teaching me the lesson directly, how to make his choices sound like mine. I know now what that was. It took me 28 years and a deathbed confession and a lot of nights in a linen closet to be able to say it plainly. But I know now. And that's what this story is about. The thing about a smear campaign is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive at your door with a label. It seeps in, through a phone call that ends a little too quickly, through a friend who suddenly has less time, through the specific silence of people who used to speak freely around you and now choose their words with a care that tells you everything. I didn't know Douglas had a way of managing my relationships until after he died. That's the part that took the longest to absorb. Not the Portugal trip. Not the teaching position I didn't take. Not the community college enrollment form I filled out in 2008 and never submitted. 2 courses. English literature, and introduction to painting. Classes I had circled in the catalog with a blue pen and then folded into the back of a drawer when the air in the house made it clear that wanting something for myself was a disruption in a system I hadn't even realized we had. It was the relationships. That's what I found when I started going back through things. That's what the legal pad was really about. After he died, I started writing things down. Not as an accusation, I want to be clear about that. I wasn't building a case. I was just trying to understand the arithmetic of a life. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I started listing the moments I remembered where something had shifted, where a person had moved slightly away from me, where a plan had quietly dissolved, where I had made a choice I couldn't quite remember making. And the further I went back, the more visible the pattern became. There was my college roommate, Diane. We had been close, the kind of close you only get when you live 3 feet apart for 2 years and share everything without thinking about it. After I married Douglas, she came to visit us once, in that first year. Just one weekend. I remember she and I stayed up too late talking in the kitchen while Douglas was asleep, and I remember laughing in a way I hadn't laughed in months. She left on a Sunday, and then, over the following year, her calls got shorter, her responses got slower. By the time Mara was born, we had faded to Christmas cards. I found out, from someone who knew us both, that Douglas had called Diane at some point in that first year, had a conversation with her, a friendly conversation by all accounts. Douglas was always friendly. He had mentioned, in that calm and certain way of his, that I was going through a difficult adjustment to married life, that I sometimes said things I didn't mean, that he was worried about me and hoped she wouldn't take anything I said too seriously. Diane was not a bad person. She was just a person who received information from a man who seemed solid and believable, and she adjusted accordingly. That's how it works. You don't need to tell someone to pull away from a friend. You just need to make them slightly uncertain about her. I sat at that kitchen table and I thought about Diane and about the others. There were others. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, something colder and more specific than rage. The feeling of a woman looking at a lock she has been pressing against for years, and finally understanding that it was not stuck. It was locked from the inside by someone with a key. And here's what I keep coming back to even now, even as I'm telling you this. Douglas did not do those things because he hated me. He did them because he was terrified. Terrified that if I had the full range of my own life, the friends, the trips, the courses, the conversations that had nothing to do with him, I would eventually look around and realize I had somewhere else to be. He managed me because the alternative, in his mind, was losing me. And the tragedy, the thing that makes this complicated in a way I can't fully resolve, is that he was probably right that I would have grown. He was just wrong about what that growth would have meant for us. But here's what I want to ask you, and I mean this genuinely, because I've been turning it over since I started understanding all of this. Have you ever had someone use your love for them as the very mechanism of your own limitation? Someone who knew exactly which door to knock on because they knew you'd answer, and who used that knowledge not to hurt you, but to keep you. Because that's the thing that nobody talks about. It's not always cruelty. Sometimes it's fear wearing the face of love. If that question is landing somewhere real for you right now, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And let me keep going, because this is where it starts to shift. Mara drove up from Nashville on a Saturday 3 weeks after I had started the legal pad. She arrived with groceries. She always arrived with groceries, a habit she'd developed during Douglas's illness that she hadn't broken. And she found me at the kitchen table with the pad open and my handwriting covering most of the front page and half the back. She set the grocery bags down on the counter without unpacking them. She looked at me. She looked at the pad. She sat down across from me and she said, very quietly, "Mom, what is that?" I had not planned to tell her. I want to be honest about that. I had been carrying this alone for weeks because I didn't know yet what language to use for it, and because part of me was still protecting something, the official version of the marriage, the one that had 30 years of witnesses. But I looked at my daughter across that table, at her father's gray-blue eyes in her face, and I made a decision. I said, "Your father told me something before he died, and I need you to decide if you want to know what it was, because once I tell you, I can't take it back." She didn't hesitate. She said, "I've been waiting for you to say something like this since the funeral." So I told her. I read from the legal pad. I told her about the confession, about what he had said, word for word, about the pattern I had found when I went back through the years. I watched her face while I talked. She is her father's daughter in the precision of her expressions. She does not emote carelessly. But I watched something move through her, slow and tectonic, the particular expression of someone whose suspicion is being confirmed, and who had half hoped it wouldn't be. When I finished, she sat with it for a full minute. The kind of silence between two people who know each other well enough not to fill it. Then she said, "He loved you, and he was terrified of you, and he made you smaller so he could manage the fear. And he told you the truth when it was too late to change anything." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you want to know if you're allowed to be angry." I said, "I want to know if I'm allowed to also be grateful for the confession, even though it came 30 years too late." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, you are allowed to feel every single thing you feel, at the same time, without having to decide which one is correct." I had raised this person. I had packed her lunches and driven her to her first job interview, and watched her walk away from a relationship I later learned had reminded her too much of her father. And sitting there in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, she said the truest thing anyone had said to me in years, maybe longer. Patrick came by that evening. He hadn't been invited. It was just a Sunday visit, his habit, the way he'd shown up every week since Douglas died, sometimes just to sit in the same room with me for an hour, and then go home. He came in through the back door the way he always did, still in his work jacket, his father's Timex on his wrist, and he found Mara still at the table with me, and the legal pad still open between us. I started to tell him. I got partway through. He stood up before I was halfway done. He pressed his knuckles against the edge of the counter, a gesture so exactly like his father's that it stopped my breath for a second. And he said, his voice doing that controlled, tight thing it does when he is working very hard not to feel something. "Mom, I don't know what he told you, but he was dying. People say things when they're dying." I said, "I know." He said, "He was a good man." I said, "I know that too." "Then why—" He stopped. He pressed harder against the counter. "Why are you doing this now? He can't even—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't finish it because the end of it would have required him to say, "He can't even defend himself." And somewhere in Patrick's chest, even in his grief, he knew that wasn't quite the right frame, and he didn't know what to do with that knowing. I looked at my son, at his father's build, and my own eyes in his face, and I said something I had not planned. "Patrick, I'm not taking him from you. I'm just finally taking something back for myself." He left shortly after. He drove home. 2 hours later my phone rang, and it was him, and he said, "I'm sorry for leaving like that." And I told him he had nothing to apologize for. Neither of us mentioned the confession again that night. But something had shifted, quietly, between us, the way a door shifts in a frame when the season changes. It hadn't opened yet, but it had moved. Gail came over 2 days later. She called first. She always calls first. A courtesy she developed after years of watching people show up uninvited at difficult moments. And she said, "I'm coming over after work. Don't clean anything." Which meant she already knew something was happening, the way Gail always knows something is happening before you've decided to tell her. She arrived at 6:43 in her burgundy wrap dress and her amber earrings, and she sat down at my kitchen table and accepted the glass of grocery store white wine I poured her without comment on the wine, which is how I knew she was in serious mode. Gail has opinions about wine. When she doesn't share them, she is focusing on something more important. I told her everything. The confession, word for word, the legal pad, the pattern I had found going back through the years, Diane, the Portugal trip, the enrollment form folded into the back of a drawer, the conversation with Mara, the conversation with Patrick. I talked for a long time. Gail did not interrupt once, which is its own form of love from a woman who is, by nature and by preference, a participant in conversation, rather than a container for it. When I finished, she set down her wine glass. She looked at me for a moment with those dark brown eyes that are warm and precise in equal measure. And then she said, "You know why he told you." I said, "He wanted me to know before he—" No, she said it quietly, but she said it firmly. "He told you because he needed to die knowing you had the truth. The confession wasn't for you, Renee. Not entirely. It was for him." I sat with that. It went in somewhere deep, and it hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true, and I had already half known it, and hearing it said out loud by someone who loved me made it impossible to unknow. "That doesn't make it not real," I said. "No," she agreed. "It makes it both things, real and selfish, loving and self-serving, the way he was." The silence between us was the comfortable kind, the kind that is only available between women who have known each other long enough to have stopped performing inside it. Outside, it was getting dark the way it does in November, quickly, without ceremony, the light just deciding it's done for the day. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. It arrived fully formed from somewhere below my thinking mind, from whatever part of a person processes things while the conscious brain is busy folding pillowcases at 3 in the morning. I said, "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life deciding whether to be grateful or angry. I think I'm going to be both. And I think I'm going to use what's left of my time being something that isn't either." Gail looked at me. "What's that?" "Myself," I said. "Just myself. Whatever that turns out to be." She picked up her wine glass. She held it up slightly. Not a toast, exactly. More like an acknowledgement. The way you might lift your hand to someone across a room when words are too far to carry. I want to stop here for just a second. Because that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with Gail, saying that sentence out loud for the first time, that was the moment I understood what the confession had actually given me. Not an explanation, not an apology exactly. Permission. Permission I should never have needed from anyone, least of all from a dying man. But there it was. And if you have ever been handed something you needed, too late, from someone who should have offered it sooner, if you know the specific ache of receiving the right thing at the wrong time, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't, because what comes next is the part where I finally figure out what to do with it. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. Something had been named, and named things, I was learning, behave differently than unnamed ones. They take up a different kind of space, more honest, less consuming. I went back to work. I am an administrative coordinator at a medical billing office. Scheduling, patient correspondence, filing, the careful management of information that other people need in order to function. I am good at it. I have always been good at managing what other people need. The difference now was that I was beginning to notice the gap between that competence and the question of what I needed. They are not the same question. I had spent a long time treating them as if they were. My coworker Sandra, who is 43 and has the specific energy of someone who has seen everything and judges nothing, stopped by my desk on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "You look different." Not better, not worse, different. I told her I was sleeping better. She nodded like that explained everything, which maybe it did. I pulled out the community college catalog that week, not the one from 2008, the current one. I don't know why I still had the 2008 one. Some things you keep without knowing why, the way you keep the receipt for something you were never allowed to return. The Tuesday evening painting course at the Community Art Center was still offered. Different instructor now, different room number, same 12 weeks. I looked at the listing for 3 days before I registered. Not because I was uncertain, I knew I was going to do it from the moment I found it. I waited because I was examining my own hesitation, trying to understand it. And what I found, underneath the hesitation, was not fear of the class. It was the residual instinct to check whether it was okay. To feel for the atmospheric pressure in the house before I made a move for myself. The house was empty. The pressure was gone. There was no one to check with. And that realization, which should have been simple and obvious, landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. Because it was both a freedom and a grief. Those two things I was learning were not opposites. They were the same country, just different weather. I registered on a Thursday morning before work, paid the enrollment fee with my own debit card, and watched the confirmation email arrive in my inbox and felt, I want to be precise about this, not joy exactly, something quieter. The feeling of a door opening that has been stuck for so long you had stopped looking at it. I told Mara that evening on the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Mom, that's really good. That's really, really good. Her voice did something on the second, really, that she probably didn't intend for me to hear. A kind of relief. Like she had been waiting for this without knowing what she was waiting for. I told Gail the next day. She said, Portugal is still there, you know. Just putting that out there. I laughed. It was the full kind of laugh, the kind that uses your whole chest. I had forgotten that kind existed. Patrick called on a Sunday, 10 days after the evening he had left the kitchen. He called in the early afternoon, which was unusual. He's a morning caller, like his father was. The afternoon call told me he had been working up to something. He said, I've been thinking about what you said, about taking something back for yourself. I waited. He said, I think Dad would have wanted that. I think that's actually why he told you. I said, I know. A pause. Then, are you okay? And this is the moment I want to tell you about, this specific moment. Because for 28 years, every time someone asked me if I was okay, I said yes before I had finished hearing the question. It was reflexive, automatic. The answer existed before the inquiry did. It was the first thing I had learned to perform and the last thing I expected to unlearn. I sat with Patrick's question. Actually sat with it. 4 or 5 seconds of real silence, long enough that he said, Mom? With a slight rise in his voice. And I said, I'm becoming okay. That's different, and it's better. He exhaled. Not a sigh, more like something releasing. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. And I could hear in those 2 words that something had shifted in him too. Not resolved, not finished, but shifted. The door that had moved in the frame the evening he left my kitchen had opened, just slightly, just enough for air to come through. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while with my hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. I thought about Douglas. I thought about the man in the hospital bed with the navy cardigan draped over his shoulders that I had put there because he was always cold in those final weeks. I thought about his pale gray-blue eyes and the arithmetic that had always lived behind them. The constant calculation of what to reveal and what to withhold, conducted so long and so fluently that I don't think he was fully conscious of it anymore. I thought about what Gail had said, that the confession was for him too, that love and self-interest had been woven together in him so completely that he probably could not have separated them at the end any more than he could have at the beginning. And I thought, I understand that. I spent 28 years doing a version of the same thing, telling myself I chose to stay, chose to set things down, chose the quiet life, when the truth was more complicated than choosing and less innocent than being trapped. I had participated in my own diminishment in ways I was only beginning to count. That was not comfortable to hold. It was also, I was finding, necessary. The first Tuesday evening class, I arrived 7 minutes early. The Community Art Center smelled like turpentine and old wood and something faintly floral I couldn't identify. The room had 8 tables arranged in a loose horseshoe, each with a small easel and a covered palette. There were 9 other students. I was not the oldest. A man named Gerald, who told me he was 71 and had always wanted to paint boats, arrived after me and took the table to my left. The instructor was a woman in her early 40s named Claire, with paint-stained fingers and the unhurried energy of someone who has made peace with imperfection as a precondition for creation. She looked around the room on that first evening and said, "The goal for the next 12 weeks is not to make good paintings. The goal is to find out what you actually see when you look at something long enough to try to put it down." I wrote that in the margin of my enrollment packet, not because I needed to remember it for painting, because I needed to remember it for everything else. I drove home that night with a small smear of cadmium yellow on the back of my left hand, where I had reached across the table without thinking. I noticed it under the dome light of my car in the parking lot. I looked at it for a moment. Then I started the engine and drove home through November dark with the yellow still there, and I did not wash it off until morning. The cadmium yellow was still on my hand when I took the wedding ring off my right hand that night. I want to tell you how that happened because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a decision I made with any ceremony or intention. I was standing at my dresser, the way I do every night before bed, emptying my pockets, taking off my earrings, setting down my watch, and I slid the ring off my finger the way you slide off something that has been there so long your hand has shaped itself around it. I held it for a moment. It was warm from my skin. I set it in the small cedar box on top of my dresser, closed the lid. That was all. I did not feel relief. I did not feel grief. I felt the particular neutrality of a right action, the specific quiet of something being placed exactly where it belongs. I left the cedar box on the dresser. I didn't put it away, didn't hide it. It sits there still, between a photograph of Mara and Patrick from about 12 years ago and a small ceramic dish my mother made in a pottery class she took the year before she died. My mother, who ran a spotless house and managed everything quietly, and never once, in my memory, did something purely for herself. I look at that ceramic dish sometimes, and I think about inheritance. Not the kind that comes in documents, but the kind that moves through behavior, through atmosphere, through the things that are never said but always felt. I had been my mother's daughter in more ways than I understood while she was alive. The painting class met every Tuesday for 12 weeks. I want to tell you about those Tuesdays because they matter to this story in a way that isn't immediately obvious. They were not transformative in the way people mean when they say, transformative. I did not have a breakthrough. I did not discover a hidden talent. I did not emerge from that room a different person. What I did was show up. Every week, on a Tuesday evening, I drove to the art center and I sat down at my table next to Gerald and his boats, and I looked at whatever Claire had set up for us to paint, and I tried to put down what I actually saw. That last part, trying to put down what you actually see, turned out to be the hardest thing I had attempted in years. Not technically, emotionally. Because what I kept finding, every time I looked at something long enough to try to render it, was that I had a habit of seeing what I expected to see rather than what was there. The bowl of oranges in week 3. I painted the idea of oranges, round, bright, simple, rather than these specific oranges, which were slightly past their peak, their skin beginning to dimple at one end, one of them casting a shadow that was more purple than gray. Claire came around and looked at my canvas and said, very gently, "What color is that shadow, actually? Don't tell me what shadows are, tell me what that one is." I looked. I mixed. I painted purple-gray onto the canvas. And it was right in a way that the gray had not been, and I sat with the strangeness of that, of how much more honest the seen thing was than the assumed thing. I thought about Douglas a lot during those Tuesday evenings. Not with anger, with something more like anthropological attention, the way you might study a habitat you lived in for decades and are only now walking through with clear eyes. I thought about how his entire system of management had depended on my willingness to see what I expected to see rather than what was there. The friendly conversation, the thick air, the choices that dissolved without ever being formally refused. He had relied all those years on the fact that I was painting the idea of my life rather than looking hard at the actual one. The consequences of his choices had already started arriving by then, though I was learning about them sideways, through the people who still called, who mentioned things in passing the way you mention things you assume the other person already knows. His pension. I had found the document 6 weeks after his death, sitting down with the paperwork the way you sit down with something you have been given no preparation for. The policy was smaller than he had told me, not by a little, by enough that the number I had been operating from for years, the quiet assurance I had been given about our financial future, was a number he had constructed rather than reported. Not a lie exactly, a management. He had decided what I needed to know about our money the same way he had decided everything else, unilaterally, with complete confidence that he was protecting me. I was more capable with the actual numbers than I would have been with the managed ones. That was the irony that arrived quietly and then sat at my table and refused to leave. I had an instinct for figures, for the specific mathematics of making things work with what you have. I had always had it. He had always known I had it. And he had, for reasons I was only now able to fully name, preferred that I not exercise it. Sandra at work noticed the shift before most people. She stopped by my desk one afternoon in week 7 of the painting class and said, "You're different. I said that before, I know, but it's more now." I asked her what she meant by more. She thought about it and then said, "You used to apologize before you said things, like pre-apologize. You don't do that anymore." I had not noticed I was doing it. I had not noticed I had stopped. Mara called on a Wednesday in week 9. She had been talking to Patrick. They talked more in those months than they had in years, processing their father together in the particular way of siblings who grew up in the same house and had almost entirely different childhoods within it. She said Patrick had asked her something, and she wanted to pass it along. She said, "He wants to know if you'd be willing to tell him more. About the confession. About all of it. He says he thinks he's ready." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 days. What I was thinking about was not whether to tell him, but how. Because Patrick was 27 years old, and he had built his understanding of himself partly on the foundation of his father's example. The way Douglas worked, the way Douglas provided, the way Douglas moved through the world with that quiet authority that Patrick had absorbed like weather. Telling Patrick the full truth was not just telling him about his father, it was asking him to re-examine the blueprint. That felt like an enormous thing to ask of someone still in the acute stage of grief. It also felt like the only honest thing available. I had spent a long time choosing managed truth over honest truth, and I was no longer willing to do that. Not even gently. Not even with the best of intentions. I called him on a Friday evening. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting for the call. I told him everything. I went slowly. I did not read from the legal pad this time. I had moved past needing it. The story lived in me now, organized and specific, mine to tell. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then he said, "Did he know? Did he understand at the end what he'd actually done?" I thought about the hospital bed, the thin voice, the way he had begun the confession mid-sentence, as if he had been in the middle of it for years. I said, "Yes, I think that's why it cost him what it did to say it." Another silence. Then Patrick said, "And I want to tell you this exactly because it was the most important thing my son has ever said to me. I don't want to be that. I don't want to love someone that way." I had to set the phone down for a moment. Not because I was crying. I didn't cry. Because something in my chest did the thing it does when a door opens that you had given up on. When something arrives that you needed so badly you stopped naming the need. I picked the phone back up. I said, "Then you won't be. The fact that you can say that means you won't be." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because your father never could." That is the moment I want to mark. That specific Friday evening, my son's voice on the phone saying, "I don't want to love someone that way." That was the moment the confession completed itself. Not in the living room with the hospital bed, not at the kitchen table with the legal pad, here. On a phone call between a mother and her son, across the distance of everything Douglas had never been able to say, in the space that his honesty, late, imperfect, self-serving, and genuine all at once, had finally opened up. If that landed somewhere in you, if you know what it is to watch something painful become, finally, the thing that makes the next generation different, hit that like button, subscribe, because that moment, that specific moment, is what this whole story has been moving toward. And there is still a little more to tell. The last Tuesday of the painting class, Claire asked each of us to bring in something we wanted to paint from life. Not a still life she set up, something we chose ourselves. Something that meant something. I brought the cedar box. I set it on the table in front of my easel, and I looked at it for the full 3 hours. I mixed colors I didn't expect. The cedar was not simply brown, it was amber and rust and a gray-green where the light didn't reach, and the small brass latch caught the overhead light in a way that made it nearly white on one edge and nearly black on the other. I painted what I saw. Not what a cedar box is, what this one was. At the end of class, Gerald leaned over and looked at my canvas for a long moment. He was not a man of many words. We had established a comfortable, mostly silent companionship over 12 weeks. He looked at the painting, and then he looked at the box, and then he said, "What's in it?" I said, "My ring." He nodded, the slow nod of a 71-year-old man who has lived enough to understand that some things don't require elaboration. "Good painting," he said, and went back to his boats. I drove home that last Tuesday with the canvas propped in the back seat and the cedar box on the passenger seat beside me. The November that had been there when I started the class had become December, the trees bare now, the dark arriving earlier, the cold a different quality than the cold had been 12 weeks ago. I drove through it with the heat on low and the radio off, and the particular fullness of someone who has done a small thing and understood, while doing it, that the small thing was not small at all. My name is Renee Halcourt. I'm 54 years old, and I spent 28 years being managed by someone who loved me in the only way he knew how, which was not enough, and which I accepted because I had been trained, long before I met him, to call acceptance strength. He told me the truth before he died. It arrived late. It cost him something to say, and it cost me something to receive, and neither of us will ever know what the marriage might have been if he had said it 30 years earlier, over dinner, instead of 4 days before the end of everything. I have made my peace with not knowing that. Some questions are not answered. They are simply carried differently over time. I am not free of him. I don't think that's the right goal. He was 28 years of my life, and the father of my children, and a man who was, in his own limited and frightened way, trying to hold on to something he didn't know how to hold any other way. I carry him the way you carry something that was both a weight and a warmth, with both hands, carefully, without pretending it was lighter than it was. What I am is present. In my own life, in my own house, at my own kitchen table. I registered for the spring semester, 2 courses this time. Painting, again, because I am not done looking at things. And a literature course, because there are books I was told, in the atmospheric way of our house, were not quite worth the time, and I intend to find out for myself. Gail and I have started talking about Portugal. Not planning, not yet, just talking. Which is how every real thing begins. Not with a decision, but with the willingness to say it out loud. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Something I've been sitting with through all of this. Has someone ever made you smaller in the name of keeping you close? Has someone ever loved you in a way that cost you something you didn't notice losing until it was already gone? And if so, have you ever found your way back to it? I want to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what you set down and whether you've picked it back up. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this story stayed with you, if some part of Renee's life touched something in yours, like this video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share it with someone who needs permission to stop performing. Someone who has been folding the same pillowcases at 3 in the morning and calling it strength, when really they're just waiting for the window to open. The window can open, I promise you that. Even this late, even now,